So this is the second session of the HTTP working group, and you may notice that we have an additional guest up here.
Yeah.
Say hello, Lars.
Hello. I guess you had no idea that I know nothing about HTTP.
So this is a joint meeting of the HTTP and Quick working groups. And today we're going to focus just on the HTTP binding for Quick, although as Patrick mentioned earlier, we had a bit of an overflow in last session. So time permitting, we might have another topic towards the end. Again, you may have seen this in last session, but since it's a new session, we should do it. These are the IPR terms that we participate in the IETF under. This is the famous Note Well statement. If you're not familiar with it, you can find it on your favorite search engine by searching for IETF Note Well. And it's important because IPR protections and antitrust protections are why we do standards, or a large part of it. Likewise, we have other policies regarding harassment, which we take very seriously. We want this to be a professional environment. So if you feel that you're being harassed or you see behavior that you're concerned about, we have an ombuds team, which is very hard to pronounce. And these folks here are folks you can reach out to and talk to either via that email address or in person. You can also, of course, talk to us, the chairs, if you feel comfortable doing that. So, blue sheets, Patrick? Good to go, thank you. If they're going around, please sign them. Can we have a volunteer describe this session? We haven't done our homework, so we're appealing to your better nature. Will someone volunteer?
Whoever doesn't scribe needs to finish the rest of the bubbles.
Jeff Hodges, you are a champion.
Thank you.
If you could scribe on Etherpad, that would be great. Yes, they were. Okay.
I will find them. And we're going to use the HTTP Jabber.
Right, and you're probably not going to have too much to scribe right away, so feel free to get set up. We'll use the HTTP BIS Jabber room just for those who are confused. Agenda bash. All we have is a discussion of the HTTP binding. We've got a presentation from Mike Bishop, the editor, or one of the editors, and then we'll probably discuss some of the issues that are related to HTTP. As I mentioned, if we have time, we had one item from the last session, which is the HTTP tray discussion that we'll give for 10 minutes at the end if we have time. Any agenda bashing? Okay. So, yeah, there we are. So, Mike, are you out there?
Doesn't look like it.
There he is. Fantastic. I don't know. Do I need to press the button, or can you just go ahead? I bet I need to press the button. Let's find out. Nope. Mike? Meet Echo help.
Okay, there we go. Somehow, apparently, when I do video, it doesn't automatically bring audio with it. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. It's a little bit indistinct. It's a quite echoey room, so if you could just try and speak loudly and distinctly, that would help.
Okay. So if we can move forward to the next slide, I don't have a way to control that. So I imagine if you're in the room, you're there because you know and care about Quick, but I will quickly recap why we care about it. Quick has a nice property in Handshake that you can get the version, the crypto, and the app protocol agreement all in between 0 and 2 RTTs, and hopefully most of the time that's 0 RTT. It has some nice retransmission properties where we don't retransmit things from canceled streams, which is not always true in TCP. And most of the frames handle things below where HTTP cares about. Mostly we care about the stream frames and how the data gets transferred. Next slide. And this is also handy for a lot of browser and app implementers, because if it's a UDP-based protocol, you can implement it at the app layer or at the OS layer, or some combination of the two. So you can update at your cadence, or you can have something in the OS that gets updated in a broad way. But as some people have pointed out, there are trade-offs that we're making by bridging layers there, and it doesn't have to be implemented that way, and you don't have to cross layers if you don't want to. It's available for you to decide on an implementation-specific basis. And transport is finding something that we've already encountered in HTTP, which is that encryption helps deployability. That if the middle boxes can't reach in and try to help what they think you're doing, they can't mess up what you're actually doing. And so Quick has a lot of things that have been proposed for TCP or SCTP improvements that we'd like to take advantage of, like say TCP Fast Open, but have not successfully deployed because of those middle box issues. Next. So in terms of what's changed since we last met in Chicago, not a whole lot on the HTTP level. Most of the work has been on the transport layer, and the changes in the HTTP draft are primarily just tracking what's going on in transport. Quick moved their special stream from 1 to 0, so the control stream moved from 3 to 1 for the HTTP layer. We also had a slight change around how mostly our examples for alt service. Because alt service always gives you a port, there's not actually a designated port for HTTP over Quick. And the draft had some examples that were UDP port 443, which is what's currently in deployment. But that's not actually normative to the protocol, so I backed that out. So if you advance, there are a couple key issues that I'd like to kind of frame a little bit, if you'll pardon a slight quick pun. And then I think most of this time will be for issue discussion. And if we want to have some of this discussion as we step through them, I think that would be a good way to proceed through the issues.
Sounds good.
So next. There are two key HTTP exchanges that cause a little bit of awkwardness with the current way streams are handled in Quick. And so there are some proposals for handling each of those. The first one is about what happens when you have a push. The server is able to initiate a stream. It pushes the resource, you're fine. But then in HTTP, there's no client response on a pushed stream. There's nothing for the client to say. But because of the stream state machine as it currently stands, the client still has to send an empty stream frame closing the stream saying, yeah, I really have nothing to say. Both sides already know that. There should be a better way around that, and there have been a couple proposals. The second piece of stream awkwardness is an early response in HTTP, where the client is sending a body that may go on for a long time, but just from the headers, the server already knows that it's going to 401, 403, and doesn't care about the body. It wants the client to effectively stop talking. So next slide. There's been a whole host of exactly what these should look like. In the current state, we have bidirectional streams. You send in both directions, and the state machine looks a lot like the HTTP2 one, where you go from idle to open to half closed in one of two states to fully closed. And then the discussion has been if we make those a little bit more unidirectional. There's a proposal where you effectively just have a pair of unidirectional streams and the state in each direction is decoupled from the other, and half closed becomes a shorthand for talking about the state of a pair. There is a pull request from Ian that proposes marking a stream when it's opened as being unidirectional so that it effectively goes from idle to half closed immediately. And there's a pull request from Martin that takes the streams to fully unidirectional that says there's a separate stream ID space in each direction. Each stream has a very simple life cycle, but then if you want bidirectional streams, somebody has to handle the correlation either at the quick layer or the application layer. Architecturally, I kind of like the fully unidirectional approach. It does seem to make a lot of people, I will say, at least nervous because it's not like TCP, but also because there are use cases for bidirectional streams as well. And I've heard the very reasonable concern that we don't want everyone to have to rebuild how to do a bidirectional stream. So I think part of what we want to do in this session is to, we have the key scenarios that are driving how HTTP over QUIC is supposed to work. So if we can start the discussion here of what we at the HTTP working group want to ask for from QUIC. And I can't see all that clearly into the room, so, oh, I see at least that. Martin?
Yeah, hi Mike.
Go for
Martin
it.
Thompson. I'm not sure that I'm really prepared to have this discussion here. As I understand it, there are definitely interactions with HTTP depending on which one of these options we take. But at this point, I think we should leave that discussion for the other session where it's on the agenda there at least.
It is.
And the question I think that is reasonable to ask at this point in time, is there any requirements that we would have? And I don't think that there are any new requirements that exist, but I'd like to hear if anyone thinks that they have any.
So, yeah, I'm not aware of any new requirements. The two that are on the previous slide are already in the Quick Issues database.
So I think one way we could look at this is focusing more on the single stream versus pairs of streams issue than on unidirectional versus bidirectional. But I'm curious at this point, who in the room considers themselves to be a I know we don't have membership, but an active participant in HTTP, the HTTP working group? Just raise your hand. Okay. Of any of you, are any of you not participating in the Quick working group? Is there anyone here who's just in HTTP but not Quick? Okay. Just wanted that information. Thank you.
I think
John.
we don't have a working group anymore.
We did.
Jana Iyengar, you just obviated my question. I was going to suggest that maybe we ask folks here who are paying attention to HTTP but not to Quick, maybe say something, and obviously there aren't any. You confused me though with something that you just said. This isn't about the two streams versus one stream issue, right?
It touches
I'm assuming
upon it.
that's a separate thing that we
Do you
Yeah,
have a
that's-
separate slide on that, Mike?
Yeah, that's the next couple. So if we want to move on to that, that's fine.
Sure. Oh, sorry, wrong window. There.
So currently, and if everybody's been following, you probably know this, the connection control stream in HTTP over Quick is stream 1. Used to be stream 3. That's a response to crypto moving from 1 to 0. And that carries session-wide information, settings, and priority frames primarily, as well as potentially extensions in the future. And currently, each request is straddling 2 Quick streams. You have one stream that carries frames, which is primarily headers and push promise. The other stream carries the unframed data, so that you don't have additional framing at the HTTP layer. If you go forward one slide, kind of illustrated the rationale of why we went to 2 streams in the first place. There are 2 key reasons. One of them is HPACK, that HPACK assumes that all data has to have been delivered previously in order and reliably, because HTTP 2 is over TCP. So if you have any HPACK frame that the packet containing that frame gets dropped, and the stream gets reset, it's not retransmitted, and HPACK dies horribly. So one reason for having two streams is so that we can say one stream thou shalt never reset, and the other stream hopefully carries the bulk of the data so you can reset that freely if you want to. The second reason is various people have said that it's a nice property not to have the headers of the data frame to strip away and have less overhead. But if you go forward one slide, we've also run into reasons why we might want to go back to one stream. And the biggest one there is that Quick gives you no ordering guarantees between streams. HTTP2 has a should that the push promise frame should always come ahead of whatever on the mainstream references the thing that you're pushing. So that could be the headers frame, because you've got a reference and a link header, but it could also be a reference to something that is in the body of the resource. And there's currently no way to correctly order the push promise frame on the header stream with something that's on the stream next to it in the body. So if you want to move back to one stream, we're going to have to fix the vulnerability to loss and header compression. So got slides on that later, but there are ways to do that. As far as the overhead that we save by not having data frames, that's relatively small. You've got a 4-byte header, and the size of the data frame can be up to 64K. At that point, you have to start having multiple data frames, but even that, we could change the max size of a frame if we want to. And some of the other proposals for how we could fix the ordering and have multiple streams actually still use a data frame on the headers stream that says, now you need to go look at this other stream to find a chunk of the body. Read there and then come back here for the next thing. Which effectively makes it one stream anyway. Oh, and one thing I missed to say, the other piece of the reason why we wanted two streams was so that we could separately flow control headers and body. That in HTTP2, there is no flow control on headers. There's some disagreement about whether or not that was the right decision, but Quick originally allowed you to exempt some streams from flow control. And that property has been removed from Quick, so that's no longer something that splitting into two streams affords us. Now, at the interim, there seemed to be pretty strong consensus about moving toward one stream. So I'm planning to put up a pull request and probably merge that fairly soon. But I would like to hear comments here from the larger working group if anyone thinks that's a horrendously bad idea.
Martin Thompson, that was fairly comprehensive. Thank you, Mike. I think for all of the above reasons, and probably a few more, I think we should shove these on the one stream. The arrangement of two streams, the fact that you look on n mod 4 minus, n mod 4 equals 3 and n mod 4 equal 1, and n mod 4 equals 3 is the headers, and n mod 4 equal 1 is the body, and you've got to cancel the body, and you can't cancel the headers, and it's just a mess. And the benefit that we're getting is questionable anyway. The idea about having synchronization points between streams and all that sort of business is something that just adds more complexity.
Yeah.
And I think
that gets a little painful.
Right, it just gets kind of unmanageable ultimately, and we have a really simple solution. We just need to accept that the HPACK cancellation problem will remain until such time as we fix the HPACK thing. And that's the problem solved, and we should solve that too.
Yeah, I think the patch right now is to force the dynamic table size to 0, at which point you can lose all the HPACK frames you want. You can reorder them. You're fine. Compression efficiency sucks, but...
Jana Iyengar, I generally agree with what Martin said. I don't think the mod 4 is that tricky to do. I mean, it's mod 4 instead of mod 2. But I think the debilitating problem for me with two streams instead of one, as we have it right now in the draft, is the one that's on this picture. It's the push promise one. That seems like a pretty bad blow to that whole proposal. And if you have to do any synchronization at all across streams, you lost the point of streams. It's not the same abstraction anymore. So I completely agree that way early on, when Mike and I were speaking about this, before the draft was even written, I think we were talking about data frames as being unnecessary. Just because you could use streams, you didn't have to use the HTTP2 framing. But you're right in pointing out that, well, of course, that doesn't add that much overhead. Ultimately, it's and it's going to be required if you need to insert a push promise in the middle of a body anyways. So I'm very much in favor of going towards one stream. It would be wonderful to have that decision made so that we can do other things. Last point, yes, on HPACK, it's going to be broken for just a little bit, but we are anyways going to try, in the quick working group, we're anyways trying to move towards either QPACK or QCRAM or one of those proposals. We know that that's what the end goal is. And in both of those cases, we can make it work with a single stream, with resetting the body. So I think I'd be very much in support of going towards one stream.
Suppose Anger, I also wanted to echo my support for one stream proposal. I think it also removes the precedent of interrelationships between streams that other application transports that are designed on this. Take the example and say that streams are you can just use the next stream and you don't need to maintain complex relationships between streams, and might in the future simplify multiplexing application transports over one quick transport as well, if we don't have to reserve certain streams.
That's a good point.
Anyone else for the blue sheets, put your hand up.
Ian Sweat, Google. I also wanted to say that I support this change, and the main reason that I thought two streams before was a good idea was the whole cancellation issue, that obviously you wanted to be able to cancel the body. And the fact that before you couldn't cancel the headers because of the compression algorithm, and the fact that you're going to fix that with QPACK in your new draft, or have actually fixed it, pretty much removes the entire reason from my perspective. But all the other reasons are good reasons too. So you should do it.
Okay, Mike. Line is empty.
Okay. Wow, the echo here is pretty bad again. All right, next slide.
Sure. So I didn't hear any concerns about going to two streams.
So yeah, that seemed pretty unanimous, so I will get a pull request in for that, hopefully this week.
Thanks, Mike.
So on the note of header compression, we currently still use HPACK as is in draft 4. We have a sequence number on the HPACK frames which requires you to decompress them in the order they were encoded. It's not any more head of line blocking than it used to be, but it's no better. We'd ideally like it to be better. So we have two actual proposals on the table, and we also have the lock HPACK to a zero size dynamic table, which, as noted, is kind of drops your compression efficiency, but would let you get rid of the sequence number, which is eventually going away anyway. So that might be a nice thing to switch to if we're moving to a single stream, as just a way to keep the draft in a you could build this state, even if we know that that's going to be replaced. So is there anyone who would be opposed to me switching to that in draft 5, even if we know we're going to replace it again later? Speak now. Okay, so I'll include that as part of my pull request. So if you go to the next slide, The two drafts are both HPACK derived. And full disclosure, QPAC is the one that I wrote. I'm trying to present them relatively evenly here. QPAC has a new wire format that, if you look at it, will be very, very familiar to you if you have built HPACK before, but it is not HPACK's wire format. QCram is much closer to HPACK, and in fact, the same compressor could output either one. With some, it has some additions on the headers frame to communicate additional information. QCram, I think the way I would generalize it is that QCram requires a lot of things that a QPAC implementation might choose to do. So QPAC is more focused on the wire format and lets you manage your trade-off between I want to guarantee there will never be head-of-line blocking, or I want the best efficiency possible and I'm willing to take some risk. And I think that's what Facebook's data, they had done an implementation of each and run it against some sample header streams, and found that with QPAC you could get some head-of-line blocking if your implementation chooses to go for greatest efficiency, and the header compression rate matches that. They both avoid the lost data risk by having one stream carry all the instructions that update the table and doesn't emit any state for a particular request, and then on stream only uses the table to emit headers. Buck put out an updated draft of QCram earlier this week that incorporates that technique. I'm sorry, the slides don't reflect that. So both of them at this point are reset resilient. And QCram assumes that you have some access to how frames are going to get packed in the packet that you're about to send. QPAC doesn't specify that, although there again, I could see an implementation choosing to do that as an optimization. So I think they're actually very similar in a lot of respects once you get down to it. And I don't know if at this point we're ready to actually express a preference as a working group and pick one to move forward, or if we want to just sit on HPACK with a zero size table for a while.
Let's see what the room thinks.
So, Martin Thompson, I was pleased to see that Buck had revised his draft this week and spent a bit of time with it. There's a number of things in there that make me sad about that particular proposal, to the extent that I think I would very much prefer QPAC. And the primary one is that it requires knowledge of your packetization logic at the point that you encode the headers. And that is hazardous in light of the fact that you might have to send that data in different packets at some point in the future in case of loss. And there's no treatment of that at all in the draft, unfortunately. And I think that's the single most brittle part of the whole thing. And yes, while it doesn't rely on that, I think it relies on that for performance reasons. And the recommendation to have that degree of awareness is problematic. The other thing that I noticed was that it has an eviction race problem. And the eviction race problem, the way that it resolves that problem is failing. It's like, halt and catch fire if this happens. And that, to me, is problematic for other reasons. We know in HPACK that eviction is pretty damned common. It happens all the time, particularly in long-lived connections. And if you set this up for failure, then you're setting yourself up for failure by doing it that way.
So Buck is in the queue. I'm going to try and see if we can make that work so he can, I assume, to respond.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Yeah, so I do want to respond. On the first point, I think maybe the draft could be clearer in that the packetization is definitely kind of optional and badly in need of data. I'm definitely open to the idea of actually just removing that. I think, in fact, we could get some clarification from Alan, but I think in his study it was not fully implemented. But Alan can clarify. I'm not really convinced. I don't have data yet on how much it moves the needle. It could be that it doesn't move the needle much at all. Analogous, I think, to what I heard about the original HPACK, where there were smarter proposals, and in the end, the performance difference wasn't enough, and simplicity sort of ruled. The part that does, there's sort of two forms of this packetization, or two forms of transport coordination in QCram. The other one is just knowing when data's been ACKed. That one is kind of needed, but I would argue that one is not so hairy as the one of knowing where packet boundaries are. So I would hope.
So, look, I think that's perfectly fine. That is like a very reasonable requirement. We have a number of other places in the protocol where knowledge of acknowledgements has such a positive benefit on performance or what have you, that I think that the transport API for Quick will necessarily have some sort of acknowledgement signals regarding stream data. I think that's a good property.
Martin, can I clarify on one thing there? I know we have several of those at the transport layer, but do we have any others of those at the HTTP layer? I can't think of any.
Possibly in the handshake. Yeah, maybe in the handshake. Actually, I'm pretty sure there are a few in the handshake mapping, but I could be wrong.
That was Ian Sweat.
Yes.
So I did want to speak also to the point about table eviction.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's another one where I think we really need data. I went with the nuke the stream option because I think it's going to be very rare. This isn't any table eviction nukes the stream. This is a table eviction that is coincident with a packet drop that happens to affect the current header in flight. So I really think it's going to be quite a corner case. That said, I would also question the basic premise that table eviction is really common and long-lived connections are very common. Maybe long-lived connections are more common with H2. I think a lot of our data suggests that, in fact, long-lived connections with Quick are fairly rare. We have telemetry data on the number of streams over the lifetime of a connection, and there's a lot of relatively short-lived connections out there. In practice, my understanding was until a year ago, nobody increased the table beyond the default 4K. These days, quite a few people raise it to 64K, but it's extremely rare to go beyond that. I don't agree that table size and table eviction is actually a first order issue. And we need data.
This is Ian Sweat. I was going to actually comment that I read the current QPACK draft very closely. And on a conceptual level, I was reasonably happy with it, but I had a lot of detailed comments that probably need to be resolved in person. So in my opinion, it's certainly far enough away from anything I would want to do that I would not say yes to it at this moment, and I would rather just stick with the static, HPACK. And the QCram draft, I just haven't gotten to read the new version yet. Thank you very much for updating it. But I mean, I hope by Seattle maybe we'll be a lot more informed. But I think it's pretty premature to pick a direction at this point.
And that was my question: are people comfortable delaying a decision about this until the Seattle timeframe at least?
Jana Iyengar, I think we should, in fact, there's work on gathering more data as well. So I think it'd be very useful to actually have more data in this conversation. It's not just about design niceties. It's actually about performance ultimately. All of this is about performance. And if you're able to actually show some numbers about what's common and what's not and what actually gives us better performance, if they don't, if they give us equal performance, then we can talk about what other things are useful. But yeah, I'd like to wait to see some numbers.
Okay. I just would remind folks that when we get those numbers, it's important that they're not necessarily specific to one implementation or one deployment. We need to encompass the entire web here, not just some use of it.
Okay.
So Mike,
yes, I can jump back on the screen here. So if we go next slide, moving on to other structural things of how HTTP and Quick interact. So the setting. Oh, hi, Jonathan. It's okay.
hi, Jonathan.
All right. So currently, HTTP over Quick uses a settings frame just like HTTP2 does. Jonathan, please don't. Please get back. Okay. But so we don't allow any changes to the settings once you've sent them. So we remove a lot of the complexity and machinery of settings ACK. There's been a proposal that we could allow the application layer to stuff a blob into the quick transport settings in the handshake, which for us would probably just be something serialized that looks a lot like a settings frame, and drop it in one of those values. So then, not right now, Jonathan. So then you would need to include settings for any application that you're offering as part of the handshake. Now, the biggest drawback to that that's been pointed out is that everything that's in the client hello, which is where the transport settings are, is sent in the clear. And therefore, the entire world would be able to see your settings frame. Now, in the settings defined in the spec, there's nothing terribly sensitive in there, so I think that would probably be an okay trade-off. But I don't know what might eventually wind up in there with extensions and other settings, and without the ability to send new settings later under cover of crypto, I'm not sure if that's a good trade-off. So I wanted to see what people's opinions on that.
Ian Sweat again. One comment on this is it might be possible if we actually had a packet type or a way to define both zero RTT data and unencrypted data, client hello data, for example, in one packet. We could put the settings in the zero RTT portion.
Which I think currently already happens, because you would send the settings frame on the connection control stream or on stream 1 as soon as you have zero RTT connection. The issue there is that you don't have both client and server all the way up front.
Ted Hardy, Backstop. I have two kind of questions. One is, do you think it would be possible for us to define this in a way such that the quick transport settings are then paired with a more generic set of other application settings, since clearly at some point Quick will have other applications in addition to HTTP2, and we don't want to have a DNS application or some other later application to have to set null HTTP settings in order to conform with the protocol. And second, when you say that the client settings are in the clear as a result of this, I think that point I just made makes it hard to do the analysis of what the impact of those client settings being in the clear is. Because if all applications are going to do the same thing, we need to know what the privacy properties of those settings are going to be in order to determine what the implications of them being in the clear would be, which kind of trends me towards saying keeping the application settings distinct from the quick settings would be a more appropriate way to go to maintain Quick is at its maximum level of flexibility and privacy for future applications.
Eric Squirla. So the combination of the settings are in the clear and you only can send settings once seems particularly unfortunate. Because it means if you ever had something you want to say that was confidential, we have just no way of doing it at all. I guess so. Martin's muttering it fine as it is. Generally, that would probably be my intuition as well. I mean, it seems like there are two potential advantages to this design. One is that it might be conceptually simpler, and the second is that I guess you get to save a round trip because the client can send his settings in the first round trip. I don't think the second is that great an advantage. As Ian says, if you're doing in 0 RTT, that won't be an issue at all. So I think I'm not yet persuaded this is a good change.
Jana Iyengar, I'm going to basically reiterate what Eckert just said. I agree that having the same settings for HTTP 2 and Quick have very different, sorry, this is what Ted said, having different privacy properties seems like a problem we'd want to avoid. And so that's, yeah, the potential drawback is pretty significant from where I see it.
All right.
Where I think the privacy trade-off is a bad trade-off. Sorry.
All right. So that sounds like relatively clear direction. So if we can update the issue on GitHub, I can do that, or Mark, either way.
Great.
So we can move forward to the next slide, talking about the error space. So we took a shift in Quick to divide the error space into 4 regions, one of which is for the application. And those errors show up both when you close streams and when you close connections. There's been kind of an emerging principle that the transport should never close a stream out from underneath the application layer, which would imply that any transport error is fatal to the connection. And streams should only close for reasons that the application controls. And that would potentially let us save some bits on the error space. But more, I want to get into do we think that that is something that at HTTP, is there a reason that we think the transport would need to close a stream, and would we be okay with that? Or do we want to put as a requirement on Quick that the transport should never close something out from underneath us? And I assume that we need the ability to close the connection with an error from the application layer, which implies that there needs to be some ability for an application error connection termination in the connection close frame.
Yeah. So, Martin Thompson, I think the proposal here would be to forbid the transport from closing specific streams. It doesn't know whether those streams contain state that the application depends on, and it doesn't know that killing them is safe, and it cannot know. And that means that the error code space for reset stream would be entirely under the control of the application that's being used. But I agree that the application needs the ability to kill the connection with errors of its own. So what we would have is connection close would have effectively transport error codes and application error codes, and we would be able to distinguish between those two spaces. Does that make sense to people? And I would like to see if we can close on this one. I was kind of prepared to talk about this one in the later sessions, but since you bring it up, I think we should talk about it and kill it.
Buck just left. Okay, go ahead, Jonah. Oh, wait, no, Buck wants to talk. Hold on.
Sorry, I was just going to say clearly for the HPACK case, there's going to be some global. HPACK still has global state, and those could have errors which would require closing the connection.
Thanks. Jana?
Jana Iyengar, the use cases that we have right now, at least, it seems reasonable for the transport to never have to close streams on its own. Any stream error, as Martin was pointing out, should cause a connection close error at the transport. There's no protocol error in Quick, for example, specifically, that's going to cause Quick to just close a stream. Any protocol errors that happen inside of Quick will cause Quick to close the connection. Separately, on the second discussion point, whether an application can terminate a connection with error, I'd have to think about it some more, but it seems odd for the application to be able to do that here in Quick. In TCP, yes, it's done, but in Quick, given that we expect applications to have a signaling stream, it seems reasonable to use that as a way to signal the other side that the application is shutting down and the connection is closed. Transport part of this Quick is closed. The transport connection is closed as it normally would be.
So Buck pointed out on the Jabber channel that any kind of header compression error currently requires you to abort the connection, which is probably going to be true under whichever scheme we move to. And so perhaps we could communicate that on the signaling stream. Communicate that on the signaling stream before we abort the connection.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I think the hazard there is that the connection continue during the processing, during the time that signaling is happening, whereas having a single unified way to say, nah, this is bad, go away, and reusing all of that logic is an efficiency that we can take advantage of. I think it is mainly just an efficiency. I mean, ultimately the same messages are going to be exchanged, but having that transport aware means that now the transport is no longer doing things like retransmitting packets and providing all of the repair mechanics that it has, and reading from its send buffers and all of those sorts of other things. It's just going to be simply right we've initiated the shutdown now, and I think that I think it's just an efficiency game, but it's probably one that's worth having.
Jana Iyengar, actually, what you're pointing out is that it's maybe more than just an efficiency thing, and I think you're right, that in this case, there's no urgency at the transport, because the transport sees that the application wants to shut down this particular stream and does nothing, and it schedules it with other writes, and it could be actually queued way behind other stream writes if things aren't done right. And on the read side, again, the same thing, the transport's continuing to, so the application's continuing, exactly, the application's continuing to process data while the application on the other side long ago said, please shut down everything. So yeah, maybe there is a good reason to do this. I'm also wondering if the conversation we're having here, it sounds like it should be something that we should either continue or have again in the Quick working group. But yeah, that's fair enough.
Okay, Mike, are you still out there, or did we lose you?
You lost me and I am back.
Fantastic. Should I go to the next slide?
Yes. So this is an interesting one. I stole a graphic out of a presentation from a while back about how Firefox does priorities. And a number of UA implementations do the priorities by taking idle streams and using them as placeholders. Quick has a bit of a preference for using streams in order contiguously, which kind of makes this not work. And now it's less of an issue now that we have the max stream ID as opposed to max concurrent streams. But at the same time, you have to assume that the server is going to consider those streams that you haven't started sending on because technically you could. And maybe we just say, if you're going to do this, then you
Uh-oh. Patrick, why don't you go ahead and respond to what you think he was going to say?
I mean, I was just going to say this is, sort of always a weird little overlap, but the function it provides, the grouping function, is like really wonderful. So is it particularly hard to build sort of a fixed set of slots to do this grouping in explicitly, into our new protocol to accomplish the same end, but to do it rather than sort of abusing unused stream IDs to have a table of grouping orders?
Mm.
So Martin Thompson, I don't know if Mike can hear us, and that's unfortunate, but one of the things that he said was slightly incorrect. The max stream ID does not allow us to do this, because if we were to allow the use of streams as placeholders, then we have to allow for streams not to be opened up in contiguous blocks. We have to allow them to remain idle. And then we have the possibility of denial of service in the case where someone thinks that a stream is being used for merely as a placeholder, but then requests start arriving on it, and you've had a connection open for several hours. There've been several thousand of these things happening. Your max stream number is set to something that is based on this assumption, and now you have 1,000 extra streams arriving, and that's just not cool. So we need to. I think Patrick's request is perfectly reasonable, and we can make a small tweak to the priority frame. Put another flag in the priority frame header and say, well, the root of this dependency, or the target of this dependency, we would need 2 bits, is actually a placeholder, and the value in there comes from a different numbering space. There's other ways you can slice this particular thing, but I think that's a reasonable way of doing that.
Yeah, and I mean, it closes a little, deficiency in H2 that people don't like, that these things are unbounded in that way, and we could bound them in a better way, right?
I don't think you actually avoid the unbounded state problem based on this. It's unfortunate, but I think fundamentally the priority system that we have does have this unbounded state problem inherently, and it's not something that the placeholders allow you to fix. Sorry.
I think Buck wanted to respond.
I had a question in response. I've heard it articulated a few times that there's some unhappiness with the H2 priority scheme, and that maybe HTTP over QUIC might actually go for something different that, for example, doesn't have the unbounded state issues. Is the direction to probably stick to the H2 priority scheme, or is there openness to changing?
So far, in the discussions we've had to date, the feeling that I've heard expressed most is that we want to keep as close to H2 as we can to minimize introducing more than one change at a time. Now, I think we'll assess that as we go along, but that's the philosophy that we have in mind overall right now.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, again, from my perspective, sticking to that philosophy with the caveat that we might be open to new information that comes along. For instance, if people learn that there's a far better scheme for prioritization that doesn't have some complexities, or maybe we need to add some things to the priority scheme, we should be open to that possibility. But
yeah,
the amount of work that we have on our plate right now is frankly
massive,
worrying.
Yeah,
very worrying. And let's not open up too many cans at the same time. And this is just one of those ones that I think, well, yeah, so it's maybe not ideal, and maybe we aren't happy about it, but if we're going to do it justice, we'd have to spend a lot of time on it. And I think I'd rather spend that time on the more important issues, like getting this damn thing working.
Sure. And just for the record, I see nodding heads in the room. I'd add to that, one additional slight thing, which is I do sense a strong aversion to using this as an opportunity to try things opportunistically. I think we'd need solid data that we were actually making the world better rather than just having another go at it. We had a little bit of that in H2 and it burned us a little bit. So, and this is again not the last opportunity. We'll have to make changes in HTTP.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that since this is a quick working group document, even though a lot of us participate in both working groups, if we were to do something that doesn't directly relate to we have to change this because of how it interacts with Quick, I would want to see that as something that the HTTP working group did and sent to us.
Yeah.
And that's partly why I think a joint meeting like this is the perfect time to discuss if we wanted to do that. And it sounds like the answer is currently no.
Oops.
A summary.
Yeah.
Mike, were you able to hear any bit when you got disconnected? Or?
I heard the bulk of the audio. I lost video for most of that time. And I've moved to somewhere with a better Wi-Fi IP.
Mostly we discussed the concept of like explicit grouping nodes rather than using streams for that. I thought that was reasonable. Ready for the next slide?
Yeah. So on the note of how we relate to HTTP2, this is a slide that I had almost verbatim in Chicago, and I don't think we quite reached a resolution there. That we have tried to keep this as close in spirit and similarity as we can to HTTP2, but because of certain traits of Quick and how the integration goes, almost everything has diverged a little bit. And I have a section in the spec that describes what the differences are, what the similarities are. And I'm wondering at what point we actually, whether we want to go into the spec and say, we're just going to use separate IANA registries and call this a different protocol, as opposed to being something that is kind of HTTP2 and kind of not. I was talking with our devs as we reviewed things through here. They said more likely there's a lot of places they could reuse code, but it was looking less and less likely that they would be able to use exactly the same code on both sides, and that likely it would approach as a copy of the HTTP2 code and run that over and start adapting that to Quick. So I'm wondering, do we want to reflect that in the document, and to what degree?
So, Mike, it's Mark. I had thought, and maybe it's just my horrific memory, but I had thought that we either agreed to or at least had a strong sense that we were going to do that. Okay. Personally, I find the current registry documentation very confusing, and I have a strong personal preference for separating them, but that's just me.
I didn't think it was as strong, but if this room echoes that, then great. I have a super simple answer.
And anybody else?
Yeah, Martin Thompson. Others may disagree, but I think that at the point that we made the 10 or 12 decisions that caused us to be ever so subtly different in subtle ways often, and none so subtle ways, we did actually make a new protocol. It's unfortunate, but we made a new protocol. There are some things where extensions to H2 are very easy to port across into Quick. And for example, the stuff that we didn't get to talk about earlier on secondary certificates, I think will work perfectly well in this context. But I think we need to have at least some sort of explicit signal that someone wants, has considered the use of extensions or what have you, before we just let them work in both protocols. I don't think having something work in both protocols is a feasible plan.
Eric Scorla, I guess I'm not particularly bad about the registries, but I am and I understand that we're going to have situations where things don't work in both protocols. But I guess what I am concerned about is designing something where things have no hope of working in both protocols, and where everything new we design requires new engineering. So I guess I think I was the person to push back on this last time, and I guess I'd like to understand what principles we're actually adopting here. Because I think I saw Martin nodding when I just said that, and so I guess how do we make sure that happens?
So to be clear, I mean, I think that the intention of keeping close compatibility and where it's possible is a very good one. It's just that enforcing that alignment through the registry doesn't seem to work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the question of the registry is fine, but Eka's core concern is that we don't end up making it very difficult to gain these properties, because obviously one of the things that we're trying to preserve here is some sort of seamless reuse of the semantics that were available to us in other versions of the protocol. And if we create too much of a gulf, we end up with the possibility of fracturing between the two of them, and that would be a very bad place. I would like to see what Mike has suggested here, which is transitioning from HTTP2 section, actually state some principles under which the design was made, simply because that's a commitment from us that we intend to have this happen, and also to have that as a sort of strong guidance to those people who are building things for one of these protocols, that they consider the other one when doing so. And so we don't end up in a situation where someone unknowingly builds a protocol extension for one or other of the protocols that simply doesn't work in the other one, and we end up fracturing in various ways, because I think that would be very unhealthy for the protocol. I think we need to move in one direction as much as possible.
Right. So Buck's waiting, but I just want to insert myself to answer that real quick. I agree with that, very much so. But, and maybe this is back to BC 56BIS. Most people, when they extend HTTP, are going to be adding headers or methods or truly generic artifacts. When it's version specific stuff like H2 and HQ, frankly, that's probably going to happen here, and we will have good guidance for that. We should write some of that down, absolutely, but I'm not too worried about that.
Is Buck next?
Yeah. So yeah, let's do Buck and then you.
I was just going to give an example for that guidance section. For the foreseeable future, any large-scale deployment is probably going to want to have fallback, and so for the and so that means at some higher level, applications will go through some interface that goes either direction, like either to H2 or HTTP over QUIC, and keeping that in mind in terms of compatibility makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I like the way Martin framed it. I guess I wanted to give an example, actually. I guess with this unfortunate situation where you have these things that were designed assuming H2 semantics, and now they're hard to port into QUIC. But going forward, with the opportunity to build things that potentially, where you can take both into account, and so we can be smarter, right? And I mean, I guess I was thinking earlier, the origin frame is an example of something where you might or might not need to be smarter. But it'd be sad to have two origin frame documents, right? That'd be silly. So I guess, do you think it'd be possible to perhaps see a PR that did both these things, and then we could examine it?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think we're on the same page.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to put together a PR, or actually there's an existing one sitting out there. I would be happy to update it with more guidance. And in particular, I think we might even want to have the IANA, even if it's a separate registry, have the guidance be that you should not allocate the same code point in both registries to vastly different things. Which is,
and we can also, sorry.
Which is
also specify the
expert. So, go ahead.
Sorry. We can also specify that the experts are shared between the registries.
Yeah.
To coordinate. Just to make sure we're on the same page, when I think about that, the origin frame, good example, that document should be one doc, if Quick existed, that would be one document and the INR consideration section would have 2 registrations and it's done. A more complex, document that had some protocol implications, hopefully you'd have one big section that was the semantics and the core, artificial syntax, and then you'd have a section that's mapping this to H2, which is hopefully very small, and a section that's mapping this to HQ, and that's hopefully small, and then you're done.
That matches my expectations as well.
Okay, great.
My expectation would be that the ideal would be you just design it not to rely on order between the streams. And if it works on HQ, almost certainly it'll work on HTTP2 where you do have order.
Very possibly, yes.
Because that's the biggest thing that'll bite you. But yes, you would just have 2 registrations for the exact same frame type. Okay, and there's one more slide, which is something that I don't necessarily want to get into a discussion of, but it's been on the quick list for a while, and I just wanted to plant the seed that I mentioned before that we took out the examples that pointed to UDP port 443. And when I reviewed these internally yesterday, one of the questions that came up then was, well, then what is the port for HTTP over Quick? And right now the answer is anything alt service says it is. Because there's actually no, going from an HTTP or HTTPS origin, the only path to reach HTTP over Quick right now is the alt service frame, which means you have to have TCP embedded in there somehow. And we might eventually have a world, whether it's IoT or the far distant future, where not every client wants to have TCP. We might go the approach of, well, those clients should just know that the endpoint that they want is Quick and be pre-configured for that. We might do something like SRV records or alt service over DNS, but I feel like before we call this completely done, we should have some way to reference this thing is on a Quick port. And I don't think that just try UDP 443 and assume that TCP and UDP ports are equivalent is quite gonna fly.
Yeah.
You're getting quite the cue.
You're getting a cue. You've stepped in something. So I actually kind of like the observation here that we don't actually have a URI that identifies something, a resource that exists that is reachable only by Quick, or a resource that sits on something that's served with Quick. We have alternative services, and I'm actually kind of comfortable with that for the moment. That may change with time. The other thing that I wanted to get up and say is that if that does change with time, the definition of URLs in 3986 and the various documents that describe those describe the port number as a number. It doesn't specifically say that it's a TCP port number. It doesn't specifically say that it's a UDP port number. It's a number. And how the protocol interprets the number, how you are to interpret that number given that it is actually a locator, is something that we do have a little bit of leeway in defining, but we'd be sort of pushing on revising or updating 7230 if we started down that path, but I think we can avoid that.
Yeah, what it actually says is that it is a number and the transport is defined by the scheme, and the scheme registrations for both HTTP and HTTPS say that it's TCP.
Right. Like I said, it would require an update, yes.
I'm going to close the queue just because we do have another topic we'd like to get to, and this isn't, I don't think, anything we need to decide right now. So please go ahead.
I did specifically say I don't want to exhaustively discuss it.
Yeah, Jana Iyengar, I agree that we don't. I don't think that we need to go updating HTTPS yet. It seems like it's certainly an interesting use case where you know that the other endpoint talks quick, but not TCP, but you don't know where to talk to them. We certainly aren't in a place where we need to do this yet. We're pretty far away from that world right now.
Yeah, Eric Scorla. I mean, we talked about this actually over the weekend in the ISG meeting because of CoAP, which has a sort of similar set of semantics about confusion about the UDP versus TCP. In this case, it was TLS versus DTLS, but it's the same generic concept. And I think the IETF may need a solution for this at some point. Probably needed it last month, but it doesn't have it. But I think it doesn't need it for this particular use case for a while. I mean, it's just, I mean, it just for technical reasons, it obviously has to be the case that the scheme is HTTPS, or we're like completely screwed. So, I mean, it may be the case that we need to find some way to extend the URLs to say, actually, I mean UDP. I was suggesting to Lars before that we, make it a number which was congruent to 443 mod 2 to the 16. But didn't indicate it was UDP. But in any case, I think probably we should punt this until we have but I mean, maybe we can queue up some sort of, maybe the IAB in fact can study the question of like how to indicate transport semantics in URLs. I'm quite serious about that actually.
Ted Hardy, your suggestion to the IAB has been noted by the IAB in the form of Martin writing a note. A quick point of information to Mark. I believe I understood that you were working with IANA to talk to the current registrant of UDP 443 so that its status was clarified. Could you give a quick note to the working group on that?
An update, yes. So I pinged the current, not owner, but what is the terminology?
Registrant.
Registrar, yeah. And sent a polite note and was asked for some clarification, which I gave, and then there were crickets. So my understanding, the last I heard, is that the ISG is now thinking about a more holistic approach to this issue.
I actually don't recall that conversation about a more holistic approach, but I agree we should have one, and I guess I'd be willing to make sure we do, or make sure we start the conversation.
Cool, because if you look at the well-known ports, we have this problem a lot.
Right. I mean, I guess my speaking now as an individual, I think we should simply take all the proposed standard well-known ports and make them under ISG control.
Sure. I had a conversation with IANA, and they did assert that the ISG had that power.
Ted Hardy, it is in fact not clear that the ISG has that power. I had a conversation with the folks at IANA, and it would be very valuable if we could actually run the process that IANA currently understands to be, that it is a release and catch system where the current registrant releases it before it is caught. Now, if there is the case that the registrant is not available due to death, then they are certainly willing to say that there is no possibility for release and that the catch can go forward. But if we're actually going to say that it proceeds in some other mechanism, there is a document we must update and consensus we must achieve before that.
Sure. Yeah, I did have a conversation with Joe Touch about that because he was one of the authors, and he asserted some things about how that worked that I couldn't read out of the document. So it's at least ambiguous, maybe.
I recently reassigned a couple of ports through ISG action, but I think IANA preference is to have some kind of record, whether it's ISG action or a document. So document might be the simplest way, which just list all the ports we want to be reassigned. I mean, it's a trivial document.
So we just take that.
Yeah.
We look forward to that document coming from the ISG. No, the mic lines are closed.
I just saw a volunteer.
Nah. So Mike, was that all you had?
Yep, that's all that's in my deck. And if we had any time, I was going to propose we look at the issues list for anything else that people wanted to talk about, but I think we would be better served to get back to the HTTP topics.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mike. That was really helpful. So now it's 4:35. We have 15 minutes. And we had an item in our last session which got punted. So now that we have a bit of time, we might get back to that. Julian, are you with us?
I have a question for the chairs.
Sorry?
I have a question for the chairs.
Yes?
The issue of two streams versus one, we had the discussion here, and is there any? I'd like to see an end to that discussion. Is that something that we are going to try and
So
do
I
here?
believe the outcome was that we were going to see a pull request, and then we confirmed that that's what we want to do on the list, as
Gotcha.
with all of our decisions.
Thanks.
Julian Reschke. Julian, you need to use the special link, I think, or put yourself in queue and I'll recognize you. Oh, there he is. Hello.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay. So this is something that we've talked about a bit over the last few months, and that recently came up during the HTTP workshop. Next slide, please. So the question is, do we want to revise the HTTP 1.1 specs? And if we do so, what exactly do we want to do? So my first slide shows a bit of the history of the specs. The blue one is 1.0, the green one is 1.1, the red one is 2.0 on a time scale. And it just shows that there was a very large gap between RFC 2616 and until we got back to work. And then it took quite a long time to actually finish this. We are now currently having two HTTP specifications, one of which, the old one containing all of the semantics, and the new one, HTTP2, just containing a new transport plus a few new features. And there's also the discussion about how HTTP over QUIC relates to that. Next slide. So why do we actually want to update the document? That's because the RFCs that the RFC editor publishes are actually immutable. So people keep looking at information that from the time it was published, it immediately becomes outdated for some value of outdated. The RFC editor collects errata, but most people don't actually find the errata. Another thing to consider is depending on how much we want to do, even if we do only a bit of housekeeping, we won't be done before next year. And that would be 4 years after the publication of the previous spec. So it's time to at least think about this. And there's this carrot in front of us that the RFC editor will actually adopt a new publication format, and people will stop talking about IETF documents being unreadable and being from the 70s. So I think that it's worthwhile to try to get more readable document sets out there once we can. Next slide. So there are a few obvious things that we need to do. We need to apply the errata where we actually have a few errata that we don't have solutions for yet. Some tricky ABNF problems, for instance. There are a few references to update. We have a new issue tracker that currently has about 30 issues raised against the 1.1 specs. And then there's the issue that the 1.1 specs currently do not even mention that there's a HTTP2 spec. So even if we want to restrict us to minimal changes, we would have to put in a few pointers there to clarify the relation to the HTTP2 spec. Next slide. So this is a list of things that have been mentioned in the context of revising the specs. One co-author actually wants to reorganize the documents again. We currently have 6 parts, and one could argue that less parts would be better. Also, we have the situation that most of the HTTP 1.1 spec essentially is about HTTP in general, and only part of the first spec actually talks about the wire format of HTTP 1.1, and it would be very nice to have a clear separation, but of course that's quite a bit of work. We also have a few satellite specs that we finished after we were done with this that might be candidates for inclusion into a revision of the HTTP 1.1 spec because they are very small and essentially fill holes that we left in the spec because we couldn't actually add new stuff back when we were doing this. Then there's the question about, are we happy with sitting in the proposed standard slot, or do we want to have a full standard IETF process-wise? But if we decided that, we probably would be restricted in the amount of things we can change. Next slide. So one obvious thing that we need to do is we need to try to get people to actually report bugs. My current feeling is that people are very focused on HTTP2 specific things, and that they assume that 1.1 is done for some value of done and don't even care about reporting bugs. So would be good to get people to have a look at their notes and come up with bug reports if there's something broken. And we need to discuss how much we want to do and when we want to do it. Do we want to finish that before, next to, or after HTTP over quick? Also, depending on what we want to include into the scope, we need to organize the order in which we do things very carefully to reduce the amount of diffs that we produce. So whatever we change in the specs should be very easy to review for readers. And I think there's another slide at the end. I just wanted to point out that although the RFCs that the RFC editor currently publishes do not include errata information, there's nothing that stops us from publishing better documents ourselves. And the machinery to do so is there. Questions, feedback?
So if I heard you correctly, you're not proposing that we start this work now, but just to start thinking about its scope.
Well, if everybody says let's start now, then we could start now. But I think we should take some time to figure out what we actually want to do and when.
Sure.
So as the newer chair who did not work on the editing the documents for the last BIS round, I'm interested if, and I realize we did have some changeover between sessions, but I'm just interested to see if there's some enthusiasm amongst this set of contributors for work on this project, essentially a BIS of HTTP 1.1, tray, BIS prime. Those are all possibilities. Okay, thank you.
I'll say personally that I think this work is important, and I'd be willing to contribute to it, perhaps not as a chair, which would put some burden upon you, perhaps. But I think identifying the scope is important. I would not want it to be an engagement similar in length to the one we did last time. That went on way too long.
Yeah.
But we had a lot more to do then, I think. I think if we scope this well, it can be much more manageable. And we also have the enjoyment of more attention from implementers than we had back then. We had to be very careful back then because we needed to be very conservative. We have the ability to bounce things off of more people now, which I think is very useful and will allow us to be more effective.
Anything else, Julian, or is that kind of wrap it up?
I guess that's it. I mean, it's not surprising that there's not a lot of enthusiasm because maintenance work is never as exciting as doing new work, but that doesn't mean it's not important.
Right, and we have to balance the value of that versus, the cost, obviously, of, a lot of people's time and attention. That's, the interesting discussion.
Yeah, and that's because that's why if we want to do that, we need to clearly understand what the scope should be, how much we want to how much we are willing to change or not to change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that most of the cost would be on the editors in that due to the nature of the work, it's maintenance. If we're doing something that requires tremendous amounts of discussion in the working group, it's probably not in scope. But I think maybe we should let it sit for a while. Personally, I plan to gather issues and try and get the issues in good shape as well as get the source in good shape so that if we want to, we can start doing some speculative PRs and things like that.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I know that we actually do have a few issues that have been open. We have issues opened in the working group repository, and some of them will require discussion. How do you intend to deal with those? Because if you said earlier that if it were just maintenance, dealing with errata and correcting things that are simply just wrong, that's something that could be done by anyone at any time. They can propose an individual draft, and we can look at it and say, yes, well, that's the same document with just these changes. Thank you very much. We'll take that and publish it. But if we're actually talking about those substantive issues, then it does require more than the investment that you're talking about.
So certainly there are some that are going to require some discussion, but I think it's a manageable set. It's not 50 issues or 100 issues. I mean, I guess I'm doing this from the perspective of the last effort, which required so much work.
That was a full-time research project.
Exactly.
And as a result, it took 7, 8, whatever years. It was.
And I don't want to sign up for that again. I'm pretty sure Julian doesn't want to either.
And that was unglamorous work and also hard. So that was hard, unglamorous work that was ultimately very valuable, and everyone appreciates that. And it would be good if we can continue to capitalize on that work and keep the specs updated and relevant. But I'm just trying to balance this against what is a fairly hefty workload. We have a lot of work ongoing in this working group. It's pretty active. And we're dealing with this whole cloud of quick, and that's going to sap effort.
Absolutely, and I think this would be like almost a background task for the working group that, we're winding down some other things, which is good. The question is, okay, is this the appropriate time to do that? There's one other factor for me, and that's that, there's a lot of work going on in the browsers, in the fetch spec. I know people have very different opinions of that spec, but they are encountering some, interesting issues with HTTP that without guidance from us, they'll answer themselves. And so that's, something we need to be aware of as well. And they've been good about raising issues in our repo, but if we let them sit there for the next 5 years, well, I think we deserve to not own that anymore.
That's true. The scope thing there gets very itchy very fast, though, because some of those are requests to basically address things that were not addressed. So they're not errata, they're not these other updates. They're really almost a fork of that protocol, and we want to make sure that that remains out of scope. We're about to wrap up, but I need there's still one set of blue sheets circulating. Does anyone know where it is? Check the chair next to you. It looks like this. All right. Well, no. Well, then enjoy your cookies. Thank you for spending your afternoon talking HTTP. I know we all wish it could be all week long. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Julian.
Bye-bye.
Did we really lose some blue sheets? No, we got secretary's gonna kill us. We got 3. Yeah. Yeah, me too. But I just go. But if anybody wants to be, but if it would be interesting to